On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Jeff Gabriel. He is the Senior Vice President of Engineering at DataRobot. We're going to be talking about a pretty interesting topic, actually. We're going to be talking about how you need to balance research and coding, especially in the research space. Jeff's going to kind of take us through between the relationship that needs to balance from production and research, product management, and the challenges of moving that to research and then expecting development to deliver. I'm excited to have Jeff on. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me here.
Absolutely. So let's start off at the top, cover two things. One is if you could tell us what DataRobot does so everyone's familiar with the company, and then also as the SVP of engineering, just what are some of your responsibilities?
Sure. DataRobot is a platform for end-to-end machine learning development and production. So taking everything from data to value is the way that we talk about it. Automated machine learning, automated data prep, model serving, et cetera. What I do there is I work in our department that we call Global Machine Intelligence. So that is pretty much all of the customer-facing feature development or application development. So all the developers who have to make everything in DataRobot work, that's in my purview.
Awesome. I guess to kind of set some context to the episode, we're going to be talking about how to balance that, research component to code writing. And maybe at the highest level, if you can kind of just talk to us about how your team's structured, where does the research come in? Where's the coding aspect come in? So everyone kind of is familiar with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so research obviously could come from anywhere in the sense that if we define research as maybe pursuing a hypothesis rather than trying to code our way through some requirements, then research can pop up a lot. However, a lot of what we consider research is actually in the machine learning space in terms of either building models or manipulating data in order to be prepared to run models. It can run into some of the spaces in terms of performance and scale and capability, some of those things, but it's often in that the real research that I'm focused on is in the space of machine learning. And what that means is that we have to solve particular problems of generalizing models, making them work for any different customer, because of course, we're not just trying to solve a machine learning problem. We're building a platform that solves your machine learning problem, whatever that may be. And so there can be unique techniques to get there. There can be efficiencies to be gained. It can be about accuracy. It could be about a unique modeling approach. And so where does it come from? It primarily comes from the teams that are tasked with developing the core capabilities of DataRobot. So it's spread across the teams. And the teams will more or less have engineers who are dedicated for periods of time to research. It can also come from the office of our CTO, who will provide direction for things that are a little more forward-looking. And they get really into the pure research space in terms of taking big bets and really trying to figure out something fresh and new that we can put into the product or will have an impact on the product. So maybe a long answer to your question, but it comes from all over. But it's in those spaces of machine learning and the related activities around machine learning that form what we typically need to spend time researching.
Gotcha. And obviously, in your case, you guys are building a platform to offer these capabilities to other organizations. So solving a one-off isn't necessarily going to add value. It could grow into a bigger solution. And I guess maybe, the first question I was going to ask is, when you're looking at the research side and somebody's trying to identify a problem to go research, when does that, kernel of an idea start? Is it a particular, narrow problem? I know you mentioned the office of the CTO might have some bigger, ambitious, problems to try to tackle. But when it comes from your team, are you guys looking at, hey, here's a problem someone has, let's kind of dig into it? Or do you actually have a little bit of a roadmap out of, hey, here's some problems that we could try to tackle since we have some time?
Yeah, absolutely. And the answer is yes, it's both. We have a lot of machine learning practitioners. So that, is a benefit in terms of whatever you want to call it, sort of a homespun research idea or a kernel of an idea that may pop out. In fact, quite honestly, even the office of the CTO prefers to work that way, crowdsourcing ideas. We have a lot of practitioners, and we have a lot of practitioners outside of engineering who help customers. So there's both, hey, this is a little improvement I might want to do. Can I take a look at this and work it through? To fully roadmapped ideas. We've been hearing the X, Y, and Z problem from so many different customers. Hey, I wonder if we could solve that if we did, this, whatever that hypothesis may be. So yeah, ideas come from all over the place. I think that's an important point, really. There's a number of conversations I've had with our CTO about what it looks like to try and innovate from a group. And, if you're going to have an explicit lab, you're kind of narrowing yourself in a way that is actually not very helpful, right? Like you want to source innovation from as many places as you possibly can. Of course, then you have to figure out what to do with it, right? You can have ideas endlessly and get nowhere. And so you do have to have a process for winnowing it down and figuring out which idea you're going to pursue. But ideas come from everywhere is definitely what happens in practice with us.
So I guess, that's a good point. Ideas, there's tons of ideas, everyone, every day, every second. How do you guys, or how do you, try to find the ones that you can tackle? Because obviously, everyone has bandwidth constraints, but what's the process of determining this idea over another idea?
Yeah, and that certainly comes down to product management at some level, right? And so we're going to work that through a pretty typical product management process, trying to determine, is there really a market for this? Have we seen this as a problem? Do we know it to be an issue that we believe adds value to the platform overall? Some reasonable assumption that we'd be able to derive value out of it as a product. Of course, that's our end goal, is to make the product more valuable. And so that's the test we're going to put it through in the various forms. And I don't mean to brush it off, but just very typical product management evaluation of an idea at that point.
Fair. And I guess in your case, when, I guess a typical relationship of product management is, if you were on the software engineering side, it is structured a little bit differently. I guess if you were to provide some insights, like when you guys are working with product management, how does that relationship kind of work? Because obviously you have researchers who could be coming up with ideas, and the product management team has to fit it in. They might have their own initiatives. That balance seems to be, a little bit of an ebb and flow, probably a very tight partnership. But how does that relationship look?
Yeah, it's a good point. And product management certainly has to be a full and strong partner and understand where it's going. But it can be similar, I should say, on the research side to if I had a refactoring project or a maintenance project as an engineering manager. Mm-hmm. My product manager may have no explicit desire to get that done because it doesn't put another feature in their backlog, right?
So true.
But working together, they understand that I still have to maintain the software that we've built in the past and that I have improvements I need to do. And so there can be something of a trade-off there in terms of, hey, we're going to time box this, et cetera, which of course gets into other things we can talk about research, which is, how do you figure out what the limitations on research are? We're not Microsoft. We're not putting billions of dollars into a lab. And so, we can't just spin off and do ideas all day long. And maybe that's not what they do. I probably just offended some people at Microsoft, but
it's a fair assumption. I'm assuming they spend a lot of money trying to uncover problems that, will blossom into something that everyone's dealing with. So I think it's a fair generalization, but that's a good point. Obviously, on the software engineering side, there are components that product doesn't really care about. That's a fair point. I guess from your standpoint, when that relationship with product is kind of, it's working, obviously the impact of the roadmap, it could be variable because it just depends, when research comes back with an idea that could be, again, small, medium, super large, all of a sudden someone wants to fit that in. Like, how does the impact, occur on a roadmap, especially when you're balancing what product wants to get out versus, hey, research has come back with what seems to be a high value idea?
Yeah, it's good. And it's one of the things I've actually really appreciated about the structured approach that our product management team brings in terms of flowing things through levels of maturity and investment, right? So investment can grow as we prove out the value of the thing which is being built. Now, there are times at which you're taking a large bet because, you're going to do something that you believe it has value and you're going to push it through to the end. And that, of course, requires a full partnership with product that, hey, we're going to spend XYZ resources on this. This is what it's going to take. And we all believe we should get there. But as something is developing as more of a kernel of an idea that maybe we don't all believe in, or we're not even sure that it's going to pan out and we're not going to be able to do it, that is just a matter of having a relationship that says, I have, all of these goals. I have this many people. Let's work together to figure out where I can have a little bit of slop in my schedule. I can have a little bit of leeway on not doing one of the things that, was in the backlog. And we get a sense of priority on it. And we have to foster innovation. And, when we talk about a product manager, we can gloss over and say all they want is features, and we can laugh about it and whatever. But at the same time, they're on the same page with us, right? They want the maintenance in the software. They want the innovation in the software. And so if you don't have that, I imagine it would be extraordinarily difficult. But all of the PMs that I work with, we think alike about what the product really needs to be. And we play different roles in getting it there and maybe more or less given to certain types of development. But it's going to come back to partnership and working that through, setting priorities. So when I say that, when we have a research idea that we want to grow, we do need to set aside people for it. Maybe it's going to be one person initially, like, go away and show me something. And, very rough, very sketchy. But then we have to determine, what does it look like to prove the hypothesis? Like, what are we going to do to measure whether this is moving forward? Because research can be very, very nebulous. Not at DataRobot, but going back to my last platform at a company called Nexosis, where we were doing very primitive research on, could we solve this problem at all? It was easy to get problems that took months and months to even, we work your way through the hypothesis. And so you had to have measurements of progress that were a little fuzzy, and you're putting off time and not yet, we'll get there. And you either at some point kill it or decide that it went far enough and maybe it wasn't everything, whatever. But that's the key in that space is, should it go from one engineer to three? Should it go from 3 to 5? It's maturity. And, do we see steps of progress that we think we can measure? But those measures are going to be different and a little bit fuzzy, to be honest.
Interesting. I guess the two follow-up questions I have to kind of fit in with that is, how much research is enough? Which I guess I'm sure it's not a concrete number. And then the second question is, who's responsible for the POC? Because obviously, two different skill sets potentially, and how far does it need to go before there's a handoff to somebody to actually prove it out a little bit further?
Yeah. How much research? I guess I would just say there should always be people researching. And so I don't know that I'd put a number on it, but we shouldn't get away from it or forget about it. We have to have an investment there. It has to be some percentage of our backlog. And maybe it's in the 5 to 10% range. And I think there's a maturity of company issue there, or mature. I shouldn't say company. There's a maturity of feature line in the product, perhaps, where you could be 100% research on an entire product line as you're adding. And then that number is going to decrease as you get the number of things in the product that are stable. And we certainly follow that. That's why I point back to Nexosis for myself. I wasn't with DataRobot when they were doing their original sort of, primary research on the core platform, but I certainly was with the other, and then it grows.
No, absolutely. Yeah. The balance of, the research done, and somebody has to be responsible for taking over what research was done and building some proof of the idea or the concept out.
Yeah, that's a great question, because it really is, to me, the fundamental question about how you're going to deal with innovation becoming real in the product, no matter where it comes from. Now, it's for me been a primary conversation with, again, the office of the CTO, who doesn't control resources that can bring something to full life in the product or maintain it over time, which of course has to happen. So the handoff is really everything. And so I think for me, it doesn't go much beyond a POC before you have the product engineers that really need to understand its fit and the way it's going to work. The big deal, of course, between a proof of concept or a script that proves some formula or that some model can work a particular way is all the things that go into product engineering, right? I'd like to say that checking something into Git is like the very first step in a long line of things that turn it into professional software product. And that's with research, it's even earlier than that, right? Like you need the people who are thinking about, does this scale? Is this repeatable? Can I use this across all of the various different lines of the product? There's a lot that has to go into making it part of the machine rather than just, something off on the side. So to me, that's very early. You're going to want to engage with the team. I love the idea personally that if we sourced an idea inside of the team, that we're then actually giving the engineer or engineers who had the kernel of the idea the opportunity to work it through, right? And so that we don't take innovation and snatch it away and put it somewhere else. We're always bringing it into the R&D team. We're always working it through with the people who had the ideas or get them involved very early if it didn't come from inside the team.
Interesting. I'm going to ask you about some of the actual engineering that is required from implementation to researching. But before I do, what happens when the research to POC fails? And obviously that information, that failure, there's got to be some, again, we talk about kernel of an idea and strategy. So that kernel, something didn't pan out. What happens when that occurs on the team?
It's difficult, first of all, in that recognizing that you've failed, which isn't really failure in research, right?
Yeah.
It's just you throw away all kinds of things. Yeah, you're testing, you're trying to prove a hypothesis, and sometimes you don't have time to push it further. First of all, I would say there's very little I've ever been part of with research that doesn't leave some impression in the product. You get something, you learn something, there's some path forward. But typically what has to happen is that we just simply wind it down. There's a real value in being able to write down what you learned. I talk about, corporate memory, whatever that is for you. You have to have some way to understand what it was, what were the results. It has to be explicit. We have to know what it was that we were messing around with. You should have been doing that all along, hopefully. But then it just has to die. And so what that typically looks like is figuring out what the team can quietly go and start to participate in elsewhere. And, what's the next thing in the priority list that we want to tackle? And so, yeah, it's hard. Engineers get attached to what they're working on. Nobody wants to switch around too often. So you have to make sure you've given it a valid try. But at the end of the day, it's move on.
I like building corporate memory because I think somebody had said on a previous episode, what hasn't worked is almost as important as what has worked.
Absolutely.
So I guess the one thing that I'd like to touch on as well is there's definitely a balance. And we've been talking about research, handing over to do a POC. This seems like a tricky role because obviously somebody who's very good at researching, could excel in the role, but then they can only take it to certain depth and then they have to find a partner. And obviously then you have a loss in translation. Having someone that can do some researching to some implementation. Also, I could see some positives, but that balance seems to be more art than science, I guess, or maybe it's not. But what are your thoughts there?
I would say it absolutely is a bit of an art. And it's a bit of I don't know what the term is, purple squirrel or unicorn, whichever one we want to use in terms of a person type who can genuinely be good at both, good at implementing, good at researching, and take something from those early stages all the way through. I feel fortunate to work with people that I think are that type of person, that we have some of those, but it's not everybody, and it's not for everybody. We have researchers who don't really want to be involved in implementation. Maintenance is not something they're interested in. Hardcore, quote unquote, engineering is not what they're all about. And so the handoff process, especially when you do have somebody who's not an implementer and is not going to even take it beyond the script stage, that we turn into an educational stage. It is about onboarding somebody to the idea. It's about being explicit and turning your POC into a set of requirements and being able to say, this is what we were trying to accomplish. These are the end goals, and this is how we were getting there. And then you have an implementer who's going to have enough understanding of all of the particulars. And so again, when it comes to machine learning research, and I know the term is out there pretty broadly at this point, I think, but the ML engineer is somebody that you have to have for that type of thing. And it would be the same with any other sort of particular field of research. I was talking before about, performance can be its own thing, especially when it comes to hardware performance and things like that. You can have a hardware engineer that needs to be able to take something from a research phase and actually implement that in, the appropriate type of cloud environment or whatever. That's a similar thing that has to happen for the software engineer that understands the machine learning aspects well enough to go and implement what they found. Of course, it's just easiest and smoothest when a capable ML engineer has done the primary research themselves and they can sort of carry it into that first stage. That's wonderful, but I think that's the small minority of folks that are capable of doing that. And it's not something you can hire, I think, everybody into. It's just not how it's going to work. But it does happen.
No, it seems like a definite skill set that's more rare than common. But I guess maybe the final question for you is, when you're looking at the architect to the builder analogy, you have researchers that could come up with these elaborate ideas, and at some point they're handing it off to dev or somebody who's going to do development. How concerned are you that potentially the research is intricate and complex enough that actually delivering it within a reasonable timeline just could be far off? And it's like, well, how do you then deal with, hey, great research, but could take us 3 years to deliver on this?
Yeah, that I would say is about understanding the potential value and believing that, and then seeing those progress steps. I won't say what the research was, just so that I don't step into anything with the company. But we actually had a very good example of this in terms of something that we delivered, in the last couple of quarters. It's been in baking for quite some time. I don't know exactly how long from the original idea, but it took several different forms as it made its way into the product. And before it became the final feature that you would actually look at and see today, it's been a few other things. But all told, if we look back over when did we start this, if we contemplate, it is measured in the years. And it didn't make its way into the product at all the entire time because it was going through fits and starts. But there was a kernel of an idea that has always been there. And so it's about evaluating that endpoint value and some of those measures of success. Like, we are seeing it happen. There were things that were starting to make their way into product, but it wasn't quite good enough and it didn't match up with what we were seeing from customers, et cetera. And you just shift it slightly. And so would I call it the same research project? Absolutely. Like the kernel of the idea was there, but as it was taking a lot of time, we had to keep asking ourselves, is this the thing that we want to do? Is this where we want to be? And are we getting there? As long as the answer is yes, and you have some way to measure it, then we just keep going because it has value and we finally get there. So hopefully that answered your question. No,
that was great. Actually, I was thinking, the analogy to other, areas, whether it's a writer, you see producers or directors, they had this idea for a book or a movie or whatever it was 3 decades ago, and finally it manifests, and that kernel is, kind of what you need to nurture. And I was actually thinking it's a lot about nurturing the right, foundational idea to bring the final, piece to market.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that DataRobot's founder had some ideas that are probably still working their way out into fruition in the product, just because they're just such big, comprehensive ideas. And I think you are going to have those things. And you just got to figure out what the next piece is.
Awesome, man. Jeff, I appreciate your time. Thanks for being on. If someone wants to pick your brain on anything you mentioned, is LinkedIn a good way to getting a hold of you? Twitter, what is your preferred way of doing that?
Absolutely. I am on LinkedIn, and on Twitter, it's just my name, Jeff Gabriel. Happy to chat with folks. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. No, thanks for being on. We'll make sure we include those on the show notes. That's it for this episode. We'll be back again, different guests, different topic. Until then, I always ask for 2 things. 1, if you like the episode, please share it with someone else that might. That's how the podcast has been growing. And secondly, if you want me to speak to a specific topic, let me know what it is. I'll do my best to find someone to do that. Until next time, goodbye.